Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Massa, and I have the great grace to be the director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. And this year, Boise, along with Ruth Langer, the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, are sponsoring these seminars on teaching theology as a requirement. I'm going to welcome you to this third and final session of our teaching seminar. The theme of this third session is practicing theology, and we will be discussing how we empower students to take up the practice of theology as their own. This session is being co-led by Meghan, Sweeney, and Katie Mylroie. Meghan is Associate Professor of the Practice and the Cooney Family Director of the Pulse Program for Service Learning here at Boston College. And Katie is a doctoral candidate in comparative theology, focusing on Hinduism and Christianity. So Meghan and Katie, welcome. We're delighted you could be here with us today. Have you, the two of you, talked about who wants to go first?
We did create a little bit of an outline. Katie, do you want to do the number one on our agenda?
Sure, great. So as a way of getting started, Meghan and I will just introduce our experience teaching theology first, and then we'll have everybody go around, introduce themselves and sort of their experience in the teaching theology realm. So as Mark said, I'm Katie, and this is my 6th year in the PhD program. So I've taught the Boston College course for dialogue, the Hindu-Christian dialogue course. I've also TA'd it and TF'd it. And then I also taught at a high school before coming to Boston College, where I was a campus minister, and I taught Spanish, although the two were not always mutually exclusive. So Meghan.
And Mark introduced me. Yes, I've been at BC since 2006 and have been teaching almost exclusively in the Pulse program. I'm coming off of a very bad cold, so I want to apologize for that as well. And then every now and then I've taught the Challenge of Justice, and I even taught Exploring Catholicism 1 year. But mostly my life at BC has been Pulse all the time. And why don't we start with the folks at the conference table, Katie?
Great. Casey, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Casey. I'm a 3rd year doctoral student in historical area. Before coming here, I spent 6 years in campus ministry, which involved a lot of informal, non-classroom theological education. So this is my attempt to formalize a lot of what I did then.
Great.
I'm Zach Kronovich, 4th year systematics. I have my first real teaching at the college level will be this fall. TA'd obviously, and then I've worked in parish ministry and I taught at high school as well, so it has been sort of more and less formal but lower level forms of teaching theology.
And just joining us is Brett. We're just introducing ourselves, Brett. So
my name is Brett McLaughlin. I am 2nd year systematics PhD student. I'm a US East Jesuit. I am currently teaching assistant for Carlos Mendoza Alvarez in God's Self and Society. I taught 3 years scripture and social justice at a high school up in Maine. Anything else?
Great. That's great. Thank you. And then we can go to Sarah on Zoom.
Hello, my name is Sarah Bernard Hoverstad. I'm in my 4th year in the ethics area. I have TA'd for a Pulse course and also for Islam and Christianity in Dialogue with Natana DeLong-Boss. Can you not hear me?
We can, yeah, a little quiet on our end.
Okay, sorry about that. And I am heading into my 1st year as a TF in God's Self and Society in the fall. So I've been really appreciating these conversations as I'm starting to think about my own course.
And then Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth Langer. I've been teaching in the theology department since 1995, when I was a very green assistant professor, thrown into teaching what was then Religious Quest, Judaism and Christianity, told by Don Dietrich of blessed memory, who hired me, "We know you don't know anything about Christianity, but we know you're smart, you can learn." and thanks to TAs over the years who I have learned an enormous amount from. I was not brought into the professoriate in an era when we had real training in pedagogy. I got my doctoral degree from Hebrew Union College, as did Jeff Cooley, who I see is at least here in Icon. And we didn't have access to undergraduates. So my teaching, I was able to be a tutor for some mid-rush class, but that was not a matter of actually having to plan lessons or do anything in the classroom. So the kind of thinking about pedagogy that's happening now, I'm learning so much from my TAs and learning from these programs too.
I'm
Hi,
Jeff. I teach in the Bible area. I've been here since 2009. And as Ruth noted, I'm also an HUC graduate. And I think I went through that program a little bit later than she did. And so we just had started having discussions of pedagogy as part of our program, but there was, and there were attempts to kind of formalize it. My first actual classroom teaching experience was as a teaching assistant, which meant that at HUC, which meant I had my own day of the week with a group of rabbinic students who I was helping to learn Hebrew. And so it was a very different, certainly very different experience than being in an undergraduate, in front of an undergraduate classroom.
Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, my area is American religion, and I tend to teach courses having to do with American religion or American Catholicism and American culture. So I have an interdisciplinary background. I did teach back in the day, I taught the year-long freshman theology course called Exploring Catholicism, which I subsequently learned my students called Exploring Mark Massa. Which was a wonderful thing. Right now, what I normally do, I go back and forth. So in the fall, I normally teach a graduate course, and in the spring, I normally teach the intro course to my minor, which is called Religion in American Public Life. And I'm currently teaching a very large seminar of 22 sophomores and juniors, too large really to be a seminar, but 22 students currently. I'm quite happily avoiding their phone calls and emails right now because there's a big 20-page paper that's due in a little while. We can go as long as you want to.
Good. Thank you all very much. It helps sort of to grease the wheels of conversation if we know each other's names or a little bit about each other. Katie and I thought that, we're intrigued by the question, practicing theology, and we thought we'd put it back to the group. What does that mean to you? Like when you hear the phrase practicing theology, what comes to mind? So, and for those on Zoom, we've created a form and we give you a couple minutes to think and then write down things. And then for those of you who are there, I realized we had a technology issue. So I've made a QR code. So hopefully I can share my screen with the QR code. And so that way, if you have a phone on you, you can
Check it out.
Wow,
Zoom.
I love this, Megan.
1, 2, 3.
Wow.
You can zoom in. We're not collecting email addresses. So, if those of you, don't worry if you're, I don't know, grad directors in the room or whatever. So, we want people to feel free to answer the question. So what does this phrase even mean to you, either as a student yourself or something you've observed somebody else do, or as a teacher? And so you can think about the question, and then I will put on my screen your answers as they start popping up. So I just want to make sure that everyone has had access to the QR code.
Or Brett, do you want to use my computer?
Happy to let you use it if you want. You also don't have to send it in. You can also verbally
Yeah.
process. It's up to you.
Yeah, I can also pass my phone around if other people want to.
And I should say too, part of how this question came about, a very meta question in itself, was that Megan and I realized we had different answers to the question of like, how do we have our students practice theology, and what kinds of different students coming from different backgrounds. And we had many different accounts of what this might look like, or what this has looked like, or what we hope for it to look like. And so we thought asking you all what it means first would be a good place to start.
I'm going to assume, maybe falsely, but that everyone has submitted their comments based on the number of people and the number of comments that have come up. Any observations that anyone has about what they're seeing? Do you feel reaffirmed? I do a little bit in what my understanding is.
One of the pieces that I was thinking about that I don't necessarily see represented there explicitly, although it's probably implied in all of the answers, was that I think one of the things I think of when I think of practice or empowering someone to practice theology is to give them the tools to recognize that something is theological, kind of at its root.
That's exactly one of the things Meghan and I talked about, and having had students that come from countries where religion is not practiced or even talked about was very eye-opening for me, especially in the dialogue courses where you're talking about two traditions, and then to have students who have never studied religion or theology to recognize, what is this concept of a higher power? What is divinity? And kind of go from there has been a challenge that I've encountered in terms of like a demographic of student and in getting them to even know how to identify it, where some students may be raised in Catholic school or going to Hindu temple every weekend might know, a bit more easily sort of what is theology. So meeting all those needs at the same time, I think can be one of the challenges here. So we have like recognition. What is theology? How do we know something is theological?
I also think that teaching theology is a unique enterprise in the United States, because most people these days are taught in religious studies as opposed to theology programs. And religious studies, and I was trained in religious studies at Harvard, is a descriptive, but primarily descriptive and historical enterprise where you're comparing things and trying to describe using as clear a language as possible what's going on. Whereas theology, I think, not only allows, but I think expects people to ask normative questions. So it's more than description and more, certainly there's description and history involved. But I think theology is a normative discipline. What should we do? Who is the Holy One and what are we expected to do? Which is a somewhat different enterprise, I think. And my sense with undergraduates is a more difficult enterprise, made more difficult at a place like BC, because 65% of our students call themselves Catholic, whatever that might mean. But that means 35% of our students are not Catholic. And in some cases, very few, I think we have less than 2% Jewish students, and we have probably the largest single group of non-Christian are students from China who have various things. So teaching theology as an enterprise to them, as a normative enterprise, is a very challenging. Getting them to ask theological questions and giving them power to ask theological questions is that there's a couple turns there, that's methodologically very tricky, I think.
This was something Meghan and I talked about. I also have an undergraduate degree in religious studies, and often, I don't know how many of us have had students say, oh, but I don't actually practice this faith, so I feel like I'm behind, or I'm not going to get as good of a grade. And I always say, it's not about memorizing the catechesis or memorizing the prayers in Sanskrit or something, but it's about being reflective too. And so being able to, as Zach said, identify what is theology compared to religion, what are these beliefs? What are these normative truths with a capital T? And then really, how do we situate ourselves within it? So people talking here about how my life is related to the divine being and to other humans, God's relationship with people. So these theological anthropology questions are really key. And I always begin my comparative course with a discussion on creation and theological anthropology, because
I think how we situate ourselves within the theological material is important in a way that in religious studies, it might not be, where it's, observing something from an outside perspective. We're asking students to be in the material in a certain way.
Any further observations about the questions, or not the questions, the responses that people posted?
I'm probably the least anthropocentric. People are looking at like their students' lives and where the students are coming from.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think about God and I think about the truth claims and I think about scripture and such, and then like people engaging with that. And other people, when they least first thinking about that, talking about people's context and people's selves and things like that, it's just my first reaction.
Can I ask you to say a little more, like how you open a course?
I think it would be just I think it's important to come to understand like what are some of these creeds, or what are we saying about God, and as like a foundation for some of these students. Certainly, we did intro surveys and such, like establishing their backgrounds and everything. But in setting up a syllabus, I think I would want to make sure that they kind of understood what we're articulating about the Christian faith.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful. One of the reasons why I don't do that is only because when I do Hinduism, those don't exist. So I think comparative to, I don't know, Ruth, if you have particular insights in this as well, but I try to set it up in ways that are a bit like congruent for both traditions. Like both traditions have creation stories, and then we do cover creeds. I use the McGrath textbook for that as a way to articulate, the differences between the Hindu and Christian faith, that you do have creeds in the Christian tradition, that Christians or Catholics, or depending on where you are in the Christian system, and then in Hinduism it looks different. So that is a point of comparison for me, but that's why I do it a little bit later. I don't know if Ruth, you have something else to say about that.
No, I think the comparison is going to dictate what, in the specifics of the comparison, dictate what ends up on the curriculum. And then I think that you all who are graduate students have an advantage in that you're constructing your curricula to begin with as the one semester curriculum. Whereas the rest of us, those of us who've been around at BC for more than 3 years, I guess at this point, are still bemoaning our second semester and trying to figure out how do we slice what we're communicating in half? How do we get an adequate comprehension of an unfamiliar religion in half a semester, and yet in ways that are congruent so that there is still a conversation with Christianity? That's a very different challenge.
I think this question was raised in our first session. And it's a question probably that I ask myself most often is, yeah, I think my inclinations are probably more like yours, Brett, than probably the majority. But I get stuck. Yeah, I think in some classroom situations, I'm struck by, okay, these students are trying to apply something that they don't actually understand, or they're trying to critique something, like we're giving them Elizabeth Johnson, but they don't know what Chalcedon says. And so I think there's like under the critique makes less sense without the background. At the same time, I've been TAing in perspectives, and sometimes I just want to shake them and be like, do you care at all about anything? Because the concepts are just going totally over their heads. So yeah, it's a question I ask myself all the time about like what kind of ordering wisdom, and I guess influenced by Brian and Matt, my inclination is more and more kind of a contemplative, like paying attention to the questions that you already have, and the desires that you already have, I think are theological. So then to name an experience that's latent or implicit might have some capital, I don't really know. But the tension between like, do you actually understand the claims that this faith is making? And like, are you being thoughtful about them? Yeah, I think both are important, and I'm not sure how to get both done.
You're pointing to something so important though. I had a student who identified as female Asian American, and she was a medical student, like no background in theology, but raised Catholic, went to church all the time. And she participated in a community of people from the same country in Asia, like very committed to her ethnic roots as well. And she read some Kwok for a final paper by choice, and realized some of the tensions that she was raising were questions she had latent inside herself. I love that language. And she said, I didn't realize I had a theological voice. She didn't know. She knew, but she hadn't like seen it articulated. And so I think part of the practicing theology, someone said, new ways of understanding, applying concepts being discussed. So it's also this exposure piece of here's what theology is, here's what creative things people are doing in the theological world, because it might already be there within them, and they haven't had the venue or the exposure to be able to concretely articulate it. But that's one of my favorite parts about teaching theology. And that kind of thing didn't happen as much in my religious studies days. And I just find it so powerful. And for me, it mixes that like educational and like personal formation of a minister that roll together, which I know you share as well.
Yeah.
But as Carl Rahner says in whatever volume of his endless series in theological was, I remember reading it in theology. Obviously, I think Catholic theology starts in anthropology, always starts in anthropology. But to pick up on something that Brett says, it always ends up in theology proper. And part of the problem I found in teaching undergraduates is they're incredibly inarticulate. Not if they, now, a lot of the men think, if you say, okay, what's so-and-so's batting average? They could like, this year it was this, and I mean, they have all the data right at their command. But when you ask them questions, especially the ones, I think, Christian Smith, who's a famous sociologist at Notre Dame, said that of all the religious groups, Catholic teenagers are the most inarticulate, which is of course a scandal, because the Catholic Church runs more educational institutions are passing on the faith than all the other groups combined, and yet Catholic teenagers, you ask them basic questions, and they look at you like you're speaking Ugaritic to them, like, so the question is, if you start with anthropology, part of what I think my task is to give them technical terms and explain as clearly as I can what those technical terms mean, so that they have some basic building block. They may disagree with them, I don't really care. But I mean, just to have some vocabulary that they can use, because they come in seemingly with very little technical vocabulary, which is always, when I started teaching undergraduates many years ago in New York City, I was astonished at how little they knew, or at least I'm the theology professor, so of course I'd be the last one to know in any case. But I mean, you would say like, you had 12 years of Catholic education, and I asked you what the Trinity is, and you can't even tell me. I mean, so it's like, I'm not asking if you believe in the Trinity, I'm asking you what it, So I think part of this is anthropological, getting them to see, I think Katie's right, getting them to see that they do ask theological questions. And part of it is giving them a vocabulary that makes them more sophisticated in asking those questions. So how to balance those two things, I think, is a very tricky. I mean, have you experienced?
Do you?
Well,
can I? Do you mind?
Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah. First of all, you brought up Ugaritic, which means I got a couple grammars here if you need some help. No, but do you find that? I mean, I've noticed that's the case too. I mean, you've got these kids that have gone through parochial school and K through 12 in a Catholic school, and they don't know what these basic concepts are. Do you feel, and as someone who grew up, I grew up in the Catholic Church. My parents were, my mom, was Catholic and walked away from it. And I wonder if that thing that you're talking about, their inability to articulate these things, is at least some of the legacy or even the contemporary issue of kind of a clericalism of theology. That is to say that theology is something that goes on beyond on the other side of that altar rail. I know a lot of Catholics don't have an altar rail, but on the other, in the sanctuary, that's something that the priest does, that the priest talks about, or the religious instructor talks about during CCD classes, or the religious instructor talks about, but it's not for us. And it's not for us by definition, right? Because that's something that the clergy is supposed to have some sort of control over. Is that because when I find my students, the students, at least in the Bible courses, that are most able to recognize kind of a theological question and engage in it and pursue it, tend to be the students that are from basically low church Protestant circles, that they're used to talking about theological issues amongst their peers, and that sort of thing, whether it's in Bible study or in a prayer group or something like that. That's just a thought.
I want to just to piggyback on that a little bit. I always had the sense that the idea that religion is something you learn in a catechetical situation where there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and you're supposed to sit back and not think about it too much, is perhaps a piece, because the undergrads and core are so quiet often. And so to get them to the point where they're thinking and asking questions and to realize that there is nothing that they can't ask is virtually impossible. But yet I think that that's the enterprise that we're looking for, is that you can ask the questions. You can't preach every answer you come up with to everyone else, but you have to ask the question, to struggle with it, to find truth through disagreement. I mean, that's very much part of my tradition. And I try to get the students to come along with it, and it's always frustrating. I've done a little bit more this year just by flipping the classroom, so that they're having to discuss things one-on-one with people every day, every class just about. And there's some really interesting things that have come up from that context, but not to the whole class, just in those pairs.
Can you say more about that process of the one-to-one discussion and what's come up there?
Basically, what we do is most of the reading is done in the classroom on this technology called Perusal, which allows them to annotate the readings. And they're annotating it within 4 groups within the class. I'm not sure whether that was the right number. That's the bulk of our FaceTime in class, is that they're reading the text out loud and having conversations about it. In this, if they wave me over or wave me down and say, I have this question, usually those questions are mind-blowing. But that happens only with certain of the students. And basically all the introductory stuff that I was doing year after year in classrooms, all the PowerPoints, almost all of that is on videos that I created last year when I was splitting the class in half and teaching on Zoom. So it's been pretty much a fully flipped classroom this year. But that means that the students are really talking to each other a lot more.
That's great.
Yeah, I'll see what the course evaluations say.
Yeah.
Because I'm only teaching core 1 semester a year this year and next year for the next couple of years.
I'm wondering if we've raised a lot of questions and hopes, as well as challenges, to sort of this idea of practicing theology. And I think Katie and I may both have examples of things we've done, if that would be helpful. Katie, do you want to go first, or would you prefer I go first?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so why don't you go first?
All right, I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to put in the chat a document, and then I will also share my screen, mindful that not everyone has a device. And hopefully it will let me. I find Zoom has been acting up lately, and I'm not sure what's going on with that. Like the ability to add documents. Well, then I'm just going to have to share my screen completely. And I'm sorry, I know can be a very frustrating thing, but I'll email, I can email people after the fact. So let me find you all. There you are, and share screen. So when I think about this idea of practicing theology, I'm trying to get students to think. I want them to ask questions. I'm trying to get them in the practice of asking questions. I want them to think with, not just about, course material. I want them to take the internal turn so that the course material becomes about themselves. And I want them to try to come to a better understanding of their own beliefs and why they believe what they believe. And so I've given you a sample here of some of the exercises or practices I use in class or as assignments that I think are aimed toward these ends. And so the first, and every example I got the permission from the students. I told them I would keep their names off of it, but I do have their permission. So the first set of examples, so they have to write these things called process notes twice every semester. So that since my course is a full year course, that's 4 times over the course of the year. And they're the same questions every time. The questions don't change. The idea is to develop habits of seeing, ways of just trying to pay attention. And so one of the questions is, what philosophical and theological questions and issues are arising for you? And of course, this is in the context of Pulse, this sort of service learning, social justice course. I love this first question. So the student writes, one concept that I struggle to wrap and these are questions they submit once a week prior to having had a discussion about it in class necessarily. So sometimes their understanding of material isn't quite right or accurate. That is not my concern with these particular questions. I have the opportunity to make corrections as needed in class itself. So the student asks, one concept that I struggle to wrap my head around is the idea of free will, specifically in Augustine's excerpt on free choice of the will in book 3. I cannot understand the root of sin, since sin is deeper than a matter of rational will and choice. This is also the same question that Augustine cannot answer. However, and this is the sort of Pulse turn and the individual student's question, if we cannot answer that question, how can we stop ourselves from sinning? Like most things in life, I've learned in church that sinning is habitual. According to Augustine, we become distorted and deformed by sin. So if both statements are true, once we sin habitually, which all of us do we all become corrupt human beings? If we want to reverse the effects of sin, how can we do this? Is clinging onto the final unchangeable good enough to reverse the deformation of sin? So you hear in this question, the student struggling with the concept, but also thinking about his own life and thinking about how can we make the world a better place with less suffering if we're that conditioned for sin that we actually can't change our behaviors or change anything. So it's a question about the material, it's a question about the social justice dimension of the course, and it's also a question the student is asking of himself. And so that's that's what these weekly questions are designed to do. I will not do the next question. It's an amazing question. I've got amazing. I mean, they're just, BC students generally are amazing if we give them the chance to be amazing. I think that's, well, I don't need to go on and on, but these are just examples, and I will share with you. But the last one is a journal prompt, and it's too long to read to you out loud. But the prompt was, we are surrounded by suffering in our world, in our communities, our Pulse service, among our friends, in our own lives. What do you think suffering is? What do you think suffering is? Please be both philosophical, theological, and concrete. What are the reasons why you think suffering exists? Why and how ought we humans respond to the challenge of suffering? Please add anything else you wish. So this one student starts off telling a really personal story, but then from there weaves in course material and thinking about her placement, her Pulse placement, to really sort of think about suffering and the obligations that human beings have to one another in the context of their suffering. And so it's about her understanding of an issue using course material and how she can, as herself, can think about how she wants to respond. So I offer these as examples, I think, of trying to balance course material and the student's own place where they are in their lives. And something someone told me a long time ago, and this pertains especially to undergrads, right, is that the job of an 18 to 22-year-old, first and foremost, is to figure out That's what they're thinking about. Who am I? Who am I? And so at least maybe in a core theology course, part of what we can offer them is an opportunity to think about themselves at the intersection of theological questions, so that when they're done, they can keep asking questions. And I can't remember who said it before. I think it was Zach, actually, to get them to see that the things they're thinking about are deeply theological, and to sort of help them to continue to perceive some of their challenges and their questions as theological questions. So these are examples, and I can send it to you if after the fact. So those are just a couple of examples from me. Katie?
Well, does anyone want to ask questions to Megan, or unpack or comment on anything that she just shared? Okay, well, we can keep the questions percolating. So I also ask more personal questions in the beginning and end of the semester, like a religious identity statement. So kind of the who are you and how do you fit in? And it's after we do a week of looking at what is comparative religious studies, what is comparative theology. We do the religion and theology conversation. We also talk about inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism, sort of giving them a way in which to talk about religion, to talk about theology, these key terms, like Mark said, where they might not be able to articulate things, but they have thoughts, right? Like, is everybody gonna go to the good place, to heaven, or whatever it is? You know, we've all thought about this. We've all thought about what suffering is and why it exists. So I often find that those essays are really powerful. And when I do one at the end of the semester as well, just seeing their arc, their trajectory of students who have really taken seriously the idea of engaging with the theological material and applying it to their own life. And it's been all kinds of different backgrounds of students. Sometimes it's students who are Christian, who are lapsed Catholics or cultural Catholics, who decide to go back to Mass and to try and find a religious community again, because some of the things spoke to them in a deeper way that they realized they were missing. Sometimes it's students who, one student had left the Christian church because she experienced abuse within it and ended up deciding to want to reconcile with her abuser, and that she wanted to pursue Buddhism and Hinduism and other paths for theology that felt safer to her. So a lot of different pictures you could paint with this reflective question: who are you? What is theology to you? And then I also do, along with Catherine Cornel, and maybe Ruth, you've done this too, but I have students attend church and a Hindu temple. And so we go to these practices of worship. And then afterwards, we have a conversation with a Hindu priest or Hindu leader about theology, and a conversation with a Christian leader or priest about theology. And they write reflective papers on that. And so part of that is a bit more on the nose in terms of practicing theology and experiencing theology, but really having an embodied sense to it is something that students have found very powerful, because a number of them don't spend time in theological spaces, even just having their body, even though it's a Catholic college and you know, there's crucifixes everywhere, they're not in places of worship, places where people do theology all the time. So kind of getting them to experience both worlds, the academic and the practical, ritual, theological realm at the same time, has been another way in which I've hopefully tried to sort of expand their idea of thinking of what is theology. You can do it in the classroom, you can do it at home, you can do it at church. It can be how you live your life. So unbounding it for them, as it were.
So we were wondering if there were experiences you've had either in teaching or as a student that you remember that you found particularly helpful, a particular practice, or experiences of things that didn't go so well, that had the exact opposite maybe end of what you had hoped for.
Well, I'm happy to start, since Megan, you shared about your students' struggle with the concept of sin. This is one of the things I have a hard time teaching. Sin exists as a concept in both Christianity and Hinduism. So we cover it in like our cosmological, anthropological sort of intro to the course. And I have before asked students reflectively reflective question about their own experience committing sins, and that doesn't go well. Shockingly, they don't want to talk about it.
Because you can't grant absolution, that's the key.
Yeah.
Well,
It
it's
doesn't
not-
go
it's-
well in the confessional either.
Oh, that's true. That's a whole other.
They don't want to talk about it there either.
Yeah.
Don't they say, I saw Katie doing something? Is that how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, exactly. And even if I've tried to share, like from my own life, things like being complicit in cycles of sin or things like that, it's really hard. It's very quiet, as Ruth said. It's very quiet. Trying to get traction with those types of reflective conversations. I don't know if anyone else in teaching about sin or learning about sin has like fruitful things to offer me, but or to the group.
Well, I start off I do a 4 weeks on sin and repair of sin, and then have a paper after it, then just finishing reading the stack of papers. But I start the unit with a Google form questionnaire where I ask, I could remember, I could pull it up, I suppose that would be the other way to do it. But basically I end up saying, is sin present in our world? Assuming you said yes, where is it present? And I have a checkoff list with other on it, and I update that list regularly. So, racism, gender bias is on there, war got back on the list this year. Things that some of them are really blatant, but then I put on gossip, which used to be the students, nobody ever voted for gossip. But this year almost everybody did, which was curious. So some things which are more subtle sins, and then also, where is sin present on campus, or how is sin present on campus? And then also, what is necessary in order to repent for your sins, or to have it solved. And I put on basically a classic Jewish answer, a classic Catholic answer, classic Protestant answer, and you can't deal with it. There is no answer. And this is completely anonymous in terms of who's responded how, but I can show that, I had a class this year where a third of the class voted for the Jewish answer, a third for the Catholic, and a third for the Protestant answer. Mm-hmm. So you can I discuss it, and I show the results with the pie charts up for everybody. And that sort of opens up the categories and says that we're not talking about something which is completely abstract. Mm-hmm. And then the paper, I have them take we've been reading rabbinic texts and Augustine on sin with a little bit of a nod to post-Augustine things. And then I have the paper is apply this to a contemporary sin. Think of something that is a contemporary sin. And, a number of them were like, 2 kids shoplift or something like that. But there's been a couple others. There's somebody who wrote about suicide. There's somebody who wrote about the Russian-Ukraine war. And so a number of them really took it very seriously and took this whole theoretical construct and brought it back into something which is real in our world. Plagiarizing came up.
That's great. Thank you so much.
A go-to ready-made case study can always be the BC housing process for undergrads and participation in structural sin unwittingly by virtue of the way that the housing process is designed, because they know often the students know they're acting hard. They start having to act horribly in order to make it through a housing system that it makes no sense to them at all. And they all know this, but they do it anyway. So it's a non-personal way that they can engage maybe a conversation about complicit behaviors or other things like that.
Yeah, I think the one thing is never to ask the student, what sin have you committed?
Right. That's for the confessional.
Right.
Other examples of things that have gone well or not gone well?
one of my favorite units to teach is we do a unit on mysticism, and we read different accounts from Hindu mystics, Christian mystics, and then like people who wrestle with the in-between space of Christian and Hindu, reconciling those mystical experiences together. And that's something that students are always very attracted to. And they really enjoy spending time with the words of the mystics. And we will practice, because we do the Yoga Sutras before, we'll practice some silence in the classroom too. And that even like a minute of silence. And that's something that students are always like amazed by, you know, like being together in silence for 1 minute before or after reading an account of somebody's relationship of intimacy with divinity is something that helps change the way they look at it. And I think that personal aspect of someone's account of the divine helps them unpack things that hopefully they've retained from the course leading up to that, different concepts and terms and theological aspects of the course. So that's always one of my favorite pieces to teach.
I spent a couple of summers at St. Mylroie Monastery in southern Indiana, and they had a school of theology that hosted high school students from across the country for a fairly large conference 3 different times. And one of the things that they had us do in preparation for helping students do as well was to write theological reflections, meaning somehow drawing a thread between experiences of God, the divine, whatever, and something else. So I can remember writing something when we were being taught how to do it. I can remember writing something about playing music and sort of somehow correlating all these things together. And I think that I've never done that as a teacher myself, but it helped me, and I think it helped get to that question that I was asking earlier about what is theological, and to bring like playing music into the theological realm. The questions can be asked theologically about that. Even at that level, it's a theological it's a reflection. So it's not exactly hard theology by any means, but it's a stepping stone to get there. And so I don't know why that came to mind, but it makes me think that that's an interesting practice that can sort of squeeze the creative muscles a little bit, and maybe offer a stepping stone into more explicit theological conversation with a little bit more personal buy-in.
One of my favorite assignments, my first master's classes in theology, was our professor had us take, this is when I was a Protestant, take like a contemporary worship song and like analyze it theologically and then rewrite it.
Oh, nice.
I mean, it was not great for my judgmental soul, but it was helpful as a way of like observing the kind of latent theological claims that I've been like mindlessly repeating in front of a projector, and yeah, what kind of work that might have been doing. Unfortunately, the fruit now is I like can't sing anything because it's all garbage, unless it was written like before 1000. But I'm a medievalist, so what can I say? But it was helpful to be like, here's theology that you're already doing, mindlessly or not, and if you actually apply these kind of categories and frameworks that we've learned, is there a gap between what we say that we believe and desire and the actual performance of that belief and desire?
I do that with pop songs whenever I teach on Zoom and it's synchronous. I find like Kesha has a song about karma, fun fact. And I'll find things like this and play it as the awkward login time.
Yeah.
And then after, I'll pull up the lyrics and we'll talk about where the theology is and ask, like, does this resonate with what we read from so-and-so about this concept? And it's always very fruitful. So I'm so happy you two brought up music.
It's less on the nose. I like that.
Yeah, I think that focus on reflection is something that I've come to over the years. I mean, when I first started teaching biblical heritage, which those of you who are relatively new to BC and what the core looks like or looked like, I don't know if you remember what the old core was, but we had these 2-semester sequences, and they were largely with the same set of students, and so we would kind of plot. It was in some ways it was really nice. You could plot out a pedagogical arc over an entire year and kind of let it play out. And that was really rich, I thought. And when I first really started doing this, like in my mind, the end product was, you know, I was going to take this class and teach them how to do like biblical exegesis, you know, that was modeled on, you know, kind of historical critical exegesis, and be able to identify theological exegesis versus historical critical exegesis or confessional exegesis, like all of these things. And I realized that was not what I wanted to do. That's not what I wanted them to be doing at the end of the year. They couldn't do it, most of them, you know, they couldn't even start getting to it. And it was much more important to me for them to reflect on the themes that Scripture brings up and understand how they do or do not resonate in more contemporary situations. And so I basically abandoned the idea that, you know, the pinnacle of this core class is going to be, you know, some sort of exegetical paper, a legitimately exegetical paper, and one that is about theological, which is about reflection, which puts most of the emphasis on theological reflection. But for the students that are not particularly theological, there are other ways to address it, you know, even if they are ultimately theological questions that are undergirding everything there. So, but the idea towards reflection, as opposed to thesis-driven argument, you know, the thesis all the time, I've more or less given up on that in terms of a writing assignment for my core classes.
So let me ask you a question, Professor Cooley. How many majors are there in theology?
Currently, 48.
And how many minors are there?
It depends on how you count them. So if we include FPJ and Religion in American Public Life, yep, my count today is 102.
Okay, so just as a point of reference, there are 10,000 undergraduates at Boston College. All of them will have to take their theology core at BC. Very few people who come into BC let me rephrase that. Very few students who come into BC can avoid the theology department. But if there are only 150 majors and minors, then the core course is the core courses are the one and only touch points they're going to have. So I guess, and I'm mindful of the time, and this is a sort of a parting question then, because what is it that you hope for, knowing that if you end up staying at a place like BC, teaching at a place like BC, you're going to have the opportunity to interface with students, maybe one, maybe 2 semesters, and that's it. And once they're out of your theology course, they may never have any more formal theological education again. What is it that you hope for them to have in their toolkit or whatever by the end of the year or by the end of the semester of their time with you?
Well, that's interesting, and I would throw that back on you, because what was really striking to me was you had that one assignment that was a question about suffering. What is suffering and that sort of thing, and that's one of the themes that I come back to again and again in any of my Bible core courses as a place to begin theological discussion and reflection, and to think about what suffering is for them in their own lives, and how our theological traditions might act as a resource, but also liabilities, and that sort of thing. So I guess I would turn it to you and say, what do you hope to get out of that?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I think I was being rhetorical in my question and wasn't directing it directly at you, but mostly sort of my grand parting comment to everyone who's here today. But yeah, thank you though, because I have to ask myself the question too.
I think that to have to ask that question in the way that you did, and to challenge us to articulate that, is really very helpful. And it would be good if we had that challenge stated straight out to the whole department, actually.
Yeah, what is success?
This is something the Center for Teaching Excellence talks about a lot, and even 5 years after your course, which I find a very interesting question, considering none of us are currently like taking classes right now, or actually maybe, anyway, we're a ways out from undergrad. And so like, what do you remember from theology or religion courses as an undergrad now in your life? What do you want your students to be thinking about, knowing that they're likely not going to be theologians, 5-10 years out from your course? And that sort of influenced our like, what is theology question? And I think we've all hit upon like, everyone's doing things that are theological in some way. There's some latency there. Do we want to bring that out and like sharpen it for students, know where to go if they have questions, all different ways to think about these answers that Meghan so poignantly raised.
I should point out, as the undergraduate director, we have 5 learning goals for the core in theology. They're on the undergraduate theology website. And I encourage you, as you design a syllabus that is supposed to address the core, that you make very clear in your course description as to just how your course addresses one or more of the core learning goals in the theology department. That's my commercial.
Alas and alack, I think we are out of time. I want to thank Meghan and Katie. And I also want to thank the previous co-presenters. I think this has been a very fruitful and important series of seminars. And I'm intrigued about how we might continue this perhaps in the next academic year to talk about issues of teaching theology and engaging our students with these important questions. So thank you all. I wish may nothing interesting happen to you at the end of the semester. And we'll see you again, hopefully in a seminar like this next year. So thanks, everybody.
And if you have ideas for next year's seminar, I have a new hat for next year, as you all know, but it's very relevant to exactly these questions.
And I have the right hand hat.
But yours is old.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thanks.